Well, hello everybody. Thank you guys so much for coming today. Welcome to our third Arapahoe Basin panel discussion, the future of skiing, the science behind the snow. This is such an important issue for us, and we're very excited that you guys came to sit and listen, and I hope you guys, many of you will ask questions and have a great discussion with the panel we have today. You know, climate change is something that we take very seriously. You know, the basin is still a place we get lots of snow. It still seems cold here a lot of the time to me. But there's a couple things I've really noticed over my tenure of hanging out here. And you know, for the people hanging around that work here that are about my age or a little older, we all seem to think when we were younger it was much colder and there was much longer cold snaps. And it felt colder in general all the time. And I think to the person it seems like just about everyone my age or a little older says the same thing. And the other thing that I really notice, that we all notice here when we talk about the snow, we still have a very long ski season. We open in mid-October, we go to June. But we actually have to work at it a lot harder to stay open late into the year. I mean, spring comes fast. I think there's plenty of studies and some good stuff by the Rocky Mountain Biological Center down at Gothic that tell us spring is coming earlier. And we know that. There's no doubt in our minds. So with that, I'd like to introduce our panel to you. We got a great group today. Tori Udall is the Director of Development and Operations for Protect Our Winners, or POW. He's got a bunch of stickers in back, and I'm not sure there's any organization that's done a better job than POW at raising awareness and particularly getting young people engaged in understanding climate change. I'd also like to introduce Geraldine Link as someone I work with very closely. She directs the public policy program for the National Skiers Association. And Dr. Noah Malich. And Noah is an associate professor at CU and a research scientist at the NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena. And that's Dr. Noah Malich. And I'd like to introduce Dr. Elizabeth Maroon, who is a research scientist at the National Center for Atmospheric Research and very soon to be a new professor at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. So each of these guys is going to talk for a few minutes about what they do and what their thoughts are on climate and climate change. And then we're just going to go into a discussion, so keep your thoughts and we'll have plenty of opportunity to ask questions. So Elizabeth, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth. I'm a research scientist at NCAR. Broadly, what I work on is just large scale. So when I say large scale, I mean planetary scale climate change and climate variability. And I'm not going to talk so much about my research, but I'm going to kind of set the stage for why is climate change a problem. So if we can move on to the next slide. So what we have here, it's a little fuzzy, but you can get the idea. So the yellow curve is carbon dioxide over the last 400,000 years. So going back a couple of glacial cycles. And so you have, perfect. So you have 400,000 years ago all the way up to, you know, just a couple hundred years ago. It was pretty steady. It was low, somewhere between 180 and 270 parts per million. And then, you know, since the industrial age, all of a sudden we've gone from 280 parts per million to now we're at 400 parts per million. We have increased the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere by about 50%. And that's because of us. So carbon dioxide is a effect, comes out from combustion, so from burning fossil fuels like gasoline and coal. And we know that it's us from a bunch of different types of lines of evidence. You might have heard, oh, it could be just volcanoes, but volcanoes don't push out enough carbon dioxide compared with how much we are doing. So happy to chat more later about that, but greenhouse gases are increasing well above what it's been in the recent geologic history, and it's because of us. And as a result of increasing greenhouse gases increase the amount of heat that gets trapped in the atmosphere. And as a result, over the historic record since 1900s, we know that temperature has been increasing. So here we have a map from NASA Red indicates where temperatures are warmer than what the average was in 1950 to 1980-ish. And pretty much everywhere in the globe it's getting warmer, so yellows and reds, especially in the Arctic. The Arctic is one place where it's getting warmer even faster. And so what you can see is like the reds are about 4 degrees Fahrenheit. And this is from 2014 to 2017, so this is very recent. So this is an effect of carbon dioxide, and this is just a map that averages all the thermometers together from the world. So this is what we know is happening now. And then if we use a climate model, next slide, we can use the laws of physics and the laws of thermodynamics to try to project what will happen in the future with temperature. And so we have 2 different what we call scenarios here. The blue is where we reduce our emissions of carbon dioxide and methane, where if we stop emitting and burning fossil fuels today and really move towards more greener technologies, that's the temperature profile we would see by the time 2100, so 80 years from now. And the red is if we continue doing what we're doing now. Often this is called business as usual. And the numbers there indicate how many climate models are part of that study. So the solid line is the average of all the different climate models, and then the shading is the spread. And you can see that all of the climate models pretty much agree that it's going up and it's going up fast. And by 2050, this will have diverged beyond what we know would happen if we didn't do anything, if we changed what we're doing today. So this is all science that is very well established. And we know 30 years ago that this was going to be a problem. This isn't new stuff. This isn't actually what I work on every day. What I actually work on is trying to predict short-term climate predictions. So like next year or 5 to 10 years, that's what I'm doing right now, and trying to figure out what is the limit of climate predictability? How much natural variability is in the system, and can we predict any of that? And what we find, even on timescales of 10 years, a lot of that predictability comes from greenhouse gases. So just knowing that we're going to continue bringing greenhouse gases gives us some sense of in 10 years we know it's going to be warmer. That's a really good bet to make. And it's going to be warmer everywhere. And so with that, I'll pass it off to Noah, who's going to talk more about Colorado.
Great. Can you go to the next slide? So I'm going to start by just saying a little bit about my own experience, which I moved to Colorado in 1991 from Southern California, and Alan's anecdotal sort of observation that the winters aren't as cold as they used to be is a sentiment that I share. I moved to the Yampa Valley near Steamboat Springs at that time, straight out of high school, and I've noticed in the time that I've lived in Colorado, now over 25 years, that really the long cold spells and the winter experience is different than it used to be. And so as a human being and as a citizen, I have this sort of anecdotal knowledge, but as a scientist, I have to sort of separate that from my evaluation of data. And so what I want to do here is share some of that data with you, and then I'll end talking about kind of the human side again. So if you look at the map on the left, just ignore the middle one and the one on the right for a moment. The map on the left shows the trends in the April 1st snowpack at about 400 plus monitoring sites across the western United States. And so April 1 represents kind of that maximum magnitude of snow accumulation for the year on average, okay? And the trend from 1955 to 2016 is shown in this map on the left, where the open red circles represent decreases in snow water equivalent, ranging, you can see on the scale, from 20% for the smallest circles to 80% decline for the largest circles. So over this 60-year period, the snowpack has decreased over the region in a very dramatic way, and in particular at lower elevation areas. Those areas that are relatively near the 0 degrees Celsius or 32 degree Fahrenheit threshold throughout much of the winter and spring period. Those are the areas that are showing the greatest sensitivity. Now, the map in the middle is showing a similar result if you run a computer model which simulates the snowpack conditions. The map on the left is based solely on observations. Okay, and now the map on the right shows that if you take that same computer model that generated the pattern that's in the middle, that's similar to what's observed, And if you take away the climate warming and basically alter the temperature to say, what if the temperature didn't go up? What would the snowpack look like? And you can see for much of the region, it actually increased. So what this tells us is that the warming, with the exception of a few areas, is responsible for the decline in the snowpack conditions that we've seen over this 60-year period. If you can go to the next slide.
What are the bold lines that segregate those areas?
Yeah, the black lines in this peer-reviewed publication were used to sort of summarize what's going on in different regions. So, yeah, good question. So, take-home point one is that the snowpack is getting shallower. That has implications for water resources, it has implications for the ski industry. But what about places that haven't seen a lot of sensitivity? How has the winter experience, how has skiing changed, and how might it change in the future is another thing that we need to consider. And so some data that I'll show you here from the Storm Peak Laboratory, which is at the top of the Morningside Chairlift in Steamboat Springs, Colorado. That's where I do a lot of my research. The plot shows temperature on the horizontal axis and the density of new snowfall. So this is how fluffy your POW is, okay? And so the POW is fluffier as we move down to the lower left on the scale. So when the temperatures are colder, the POW is fluffier. No surprise probably to any of you in the room. Okay, and as you move to the top right, as the temperatures go up, the density of the new snowfall increases. The snow gets heavier. So take-home point is at the top. Warmer air temperature equals heavier snow, and thus as temperature increases, our powder's less fluffy. So Steamboat Springs, trademark, the champagne powder might not be so champagne anymore in the future as the temperatures go up. And you can look on this scale, the temperature is minus 20 at the bottom left of the coldest data points. So this is a signal that we can see in areas that aren't near that 0 degree threshold, like here at A Basin, as the temperatures go up. And then if you go to the next slide. Now all this data makes me reflect on my colleague Mark Serez, who's one of the world experts in studying the Arctic. And the Arctic is a place where the impacts of climate change have been so dramatic that you'd have to be living under a rock to not have witnessed what has gone on. And Mark gives a great seminar. He's published this book, Brave New Arctic, and I'm not shamelessly plugging his book, but when you see Mark give a talk about the experience he's had studying these ice caps in the Arctic as a graduate student, and then throughout his career watching them disappear to the point where now they're completely gone. And you watch this very serious scientist choke up and is in tears because of the loss of this very personal connection to this natural landscape. It really strikes home for those of us who live here in Colorado and really cherish our winter experiences, whether that's skiing or just enjoying a walk on a very cold, brisk, clean morning. And so go to the next slide, and this is what makes me think about that, is my daughter tasting some of that fresh POW in our front yard or here in our backyard of A Basin, and they're over there in the corner. But the trend that we're on, that Elizabeth spoke to, makes it without a doubt that whether it's my generation, or her children's generation, the winter experience and the fluffy POW is going to be a thing of the past, or at least be much more infrequent than it is now.
All right, my name is Geraldine Link, and I direct public policy for the National Ski Areas Association. And for those of you not familiar, NSAA is a national organization. We just happen to be located in Colorado. My former boss was very smart in moving the location of this association to Colorado almost 30 years ago, away from DC. And we represent about 320 resorts across the whole country. Big resorts, small resorts, And about 60% of the skier visits from those resorts occur on Forest Service land or public land. So I just wanted to give you that background about who NSAA is. We're located in Lakewood, Colorado, and my main focus, I actually have a couple main focuses, but sustainability and climate is one of them. I also just focus on public lands, natural resources, water resources, and I also do some in-house work. I'm an attorney by training, and I also handle explosives regulations for the industry, which is kind of a mixed bag of topics. But that is what I've been working on at NSAA for, I'm coming up on my 22nd year at NSAA. So back in 2002, we adopted an official climate change policy for the ski industry. And it was the classic reduce, educate, advocate kind of approach to climate change. And we've been working on it, I would say, steadily since that time. We've made a lot of changes to what we're focusing on over time, and we shifted from consumer outreach over to reducing our own carbon footprint at some point, because we really saw value in trying to get resorts kind of on the same page. And so the climate challenge is the first thing I just wanted to point out. We formed the climate challenge in 2010, and the gist of it is that resorts would have an opportunity to set a target for reductions in carbon dioxide emissions that they would like for their operations. And we developed a ski area specific carbon inventory as a starting point. So it would be apples to apples with all of the resorts that wanted to sign on to this program. So inventory your carbon, set targets for reduction, and then take action every year to reduce your carbon footprint. So that's kind of the gist of the climate challenge. And A Basin was one of the founding members of the climate challenge and has been a great partner in sustainability in my entire time at NSAA. So that is one of the major focuses that we have taken on climate change. And the reason that we wanted resorts to focus on their own operations and reduce their carbon footprint is that when we go to Washington to do advocacy, we can say, this is what we've done to clean up our own house. Because as an industry, if you're gonna ask other industries to reduce their carbon footprint and take action, you really have to have skin in the game, and you have to be doing something yourself to be credible. And so I think that was a really important rationale for starting that program and getting started. And over time, as Washington seemed to do less and less about regulating greenhouse gas emissions or taking action on climate change, the need for this voluntary action by private companies became even more important over time. The other, I think, major thing that we have realized by having resorts set these targets is that if a resort wants to go to their utility, for example, and say, how can we work together to decarbonize the grid and increase the amount of renewable energy on the grid, the fact that the resort has a target and a set like percentage change over time by a certain date, it really helps spark that dialogue so the resort can say, how are you going to help us meet our goals, because we've already set these goals. So it's just a good entree into that discussion with utilities, and there's a lot of that work going on right now in the ski industry. I would say it's pockets of work in different places, and A Basin, I think, is leading the charge with XL Energy and your partnership there. And I was invited to a meeting just this past July to come up and see all of the Summit County resorts and how that goes down, where the resorts want a certain percentage of their energy from renewable sources. And so there's some other pockets going on in Massachusetts, Michigan, Utah, California. Those are just some of the other places where resorts are working with utilities to try to decarbonize the grid. There are a number of resorts that are now starting to reach the 100% renewable mark, which I think is a really good sign. And again, this is voluntary action where we're not waiting for Washington. And Interestingly, the East, in Massachusetts, we have 2 resorts that hit the 100% renewable energy for electricity, that is. And then Wolf Creek here in Colorado met it, and Squaw Valley in California thought they were going to meet it in 2018, and then the Public Utility Commission process in California proved to be very onerous and delayed, so that resort is still pushing and pushing forward to reach that 100% renewable goal. And not only will the resort be 100% renewable, but the whole valley in which Squaw Valley operates will be as well, because the utility that serves Squaw Valley obviously serves a larger community. So there's some exciting stuff going on. Squaw is also doing a renewable energy storage project, which is absolutely key to the future of making renewable energy something that can replace fossil fuel and be reliable and be part of a smart grid. So those are some of the things going on in individual resorts. NSAA, we jumped in and with the help of Western Resources advocates who are a great resource on decarbonizing the grid in the West, they helped develop a script for resorts to reach out to their utilities and say, how do I get to a higher percentage of renewable? Also meeting with their governors, meeting with state legislatures to start this conversation on many levels at one time. One of the things that I've been working on lately is the endorsement of the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act, and that is House Resolution or HR 763, and that is the carbon, it's basically the Citizen Climate Lobby's carbon fee and dividend bill. So that's pending in Congress right now. It's a bipartisan bill, and we now have 4 ski associations that have endorsed that legislation, and about 25 ski areas across the country that have endorsed it as well. So every week, a couple trickle on. The bill was introduced in January, so we're only in April, so there's been some great progress there. A carbon tax or a carbon fee obviously is not a silver bullet. It alone is not going to solve climate change, but we see it as an important piece of the puzzle in solving climate change, and so our view at NSAA is we're going to need all the solutions. So we're working on building support now for this bill. It's not going to pass in the next 2 years because of the Republican-controlled House. However, we're building support for it now so that when we are poised for action, when we have a better political climate in Washington, some of that groundwork will have been done and we'll be more ready. One just final note on what NSAA has done in the past year is we signed on to the amicus brief for the Juliana versus US case, and that's the kids climate change case. And I see some smiles because I've been following this case for years, and I'm fascinated by it. My kids have been following it. And what these kids are basically arguing is that they have a constitutional right to a stable climate. And it's not only based in the Constitution, but also in the public trust doctrine. And so it's basically a lawsuit. It was actually brought against the Obama administration in 2015. And the target there is for federal government, really executive branch action on climate change. And so we joined on to an amicus brief of business interests to try to just raise the focus from a business angle. There were a lot of food and beverage companies, and then Snow Sports Industries America, or SIA, also signed on to the brief. And it was a big step for us. I think we just tend to focus more on legislation than we do litigation when it comes to climate change. And so that was a big step for us. Next slide. Thank you. And in January, we had an announcement at the snow show in Denver, and NSAA, together with Outdoor Industry Association, or OIA, and then Snow Sports Industries America, or SIA, the 3 A's, we all decided to get together and we formed a partnership on climate change solutions. And this, I mean, it might seem like, well, why weren't we all working together before? But the Outdoor Industry Association and SIA are very different from NSAA. They are a collection of manufacturers, basically. They're product manufacturers and retailers. That's what they do. Whereas resorts have a big chunk of land, and we operate on that land. And so you'd be amazed how different our interests are on different issues in Washington. But when it came to climate, and we were watching the current administration actually roll back common sense regulations like vehicle emissions, corporate average fuel economy standards, those kind of things, I think we all felt like it's time for us to come together and be one voice. The Outdoor Business Climate Partnership is not a separate entity. It is a partnership of 3 existing entities. So we staff it with staff from all 3 of those associations. And our approach is to support bipartisan climate change solutions and identify where our common ground is and then work together on that. We feel like we have a stronger voice in Washington when we're all working together. So the first thing that we did was develop a collective statement of what we support and what we plan to do in the future. And in later May, we'll be going to Washington together, all 3 of us, to do a fly-in, as they like to call it in Washington, and do advocacy on the price on carbon. So that's something that we're all going to be working on together. We're also working with Representative Diana DeGette, who's a Democrat from Colorado, on a House resolution on impacts of climate change on the outdoor industry and the need for urgent climate solutions on that. That was probably long, but
That was good.
a lot to say.
Hi everyone, Tori Udall. I'm the Development and Operations Director for Protect Our Winters. First, I think we should give a round of applause both to Alan and Basin and Liz for bringing us together and convening, but also to you guys. You were 100 yards from copious amounts of beer, basketball, and live music, and you're here listening to a climate talk. So just a quick round of applause to acknowledge that feat. I think that's really, really important, and it's also really energizing. I know for all the folks here on this panel who spend their days wrestling with this issue, to see people turn out and have interest and energy around it, it's pretty exciting. So yeah, how many of you have, just a quick show of hands, have heard of POW? Great, cool. And how many in the last 3 years, just doing a little case study? Okay, great. So yeah, our mission, which is has been adjusted in the last 3 years, is to turn passionate outdoor enthusiasts like you guys rejecting the beer and the basketball, you rebels, into purposeful climate advocates. So the key there of taking passion and turning it into advocacy. So we do that in a variety of ways, and we draw on this community that sits here and is represented in many ways on this panel. We were founded in 2007 by Jeremy Jones, and our theory of change really hinges on the same idea that prompted Jeremy to found us at that time, which is the environmental movement has been great. Up to 2007, it's built this incredible base, but what we realized was it was insufficient, and we were going to need more on the margins, and there was no one representing the outdoor community, us, skiers, dirtbags, climbers, mountain bikers. No one was representing us and our voice and our interests in that space. And so POW really seeks to be Base Plus and really bring thousands of outdoor enthusiasts to this environmental base and show them how advocacy is not only important, but it's a prerequisite and it's a price to pay for this experience that we all share and love. So yeah, there's the science, and these guys are experts on it, right? We can talk and show a lot of charts around the impacts of climate, but the essence of it is we need to be heading to or at carbon neutrality by 2050. And many are saying, as coming out of the latest IPCC report on climate, we really have about 11 years to shift our.
By 2025, our objective is to have our electricity be 100% from renewable sources. Right now we're at 44%.
Awesome.
We just signed up last year with a great solar project in eastern Colorado, and we're working on a local solar farm project to improve that. We've got a couple of small solar facilities on site. We're working on a much bigger one down by our shop. But that's a really aggressive goal, and we're working towards it. We're going to need a lot of help, particularly from our energy partners, Excel. You know, I think one of the greatest stories I heard within the last year was when Excel said they're converting their places where they generate electricity to renewable sources at a faster pace than they first said. The biggest single goal we have, which includes that electricity goal, is to be carbon neutral by 2025. So we just signed up with the Colorado Carbon Fund, and we've offset our energy consumption for everything except electricity, and we're really working hard on that. So we're going to be very public about it. If you look on our website, there's an annual sustainability report where we're very open about what our energy use is, what our waste issues are, what our water usage is, all that kind of stuff. But you know, we want to be the poster child for how to do this right, and we think because of our brand, because of you know, how many people are aware of us, we think we can really make an impact.
So kind of piggybacking on that, the most important conversation that we can have is what can we do? A lot of the conversation, both from the Ski Area Association and POW, revolves around carbon neutral, carbon offsets. That's great, and it's awesome to see small businesses like A Basin, smallish businesses, pursuing solar, but solar and wind dominate the conversation. Both of those have their own problems, particularly around battery generation and recycling, which is not environmentally friendly. The conversation doesn't trend to nuclear, which is arguably the only source of renewable energy that scales a globally exponentially growing economy. What is POW's stance and the Ski Areas Association stance on nuclear energy?
Yeah, great question. So Geraldine used a great phrase around silver. There's no silver bullet, and it's to solve this issue at the timeline we need to solve it. We're going to need a silver buckshot of solutions, right? And nuclear is in there. And for us, we focus on a 4-part policy agenda that nuclear is not part of, and that is not because we don't see it as being an important piece, but for us and the impact that we think we can have, we're focusing on carbon pricing, renewables, and clean energy specific on solar and wind, which are, of course, imperfect, but trending in a really good way. And then EV and zero emission vehicles as well. And so, yeah, you're 100% right. We're going to need all of it, and there's no one silver bullet to address this. So nuclear is not that, solar and wind aren't that, but combined, we're gonna need them all.
Yeah, and I would probably echo those same sentiments. I think, you know, when you look out into the future, I have a lot of optimism, honestly, in energy sources for the future, and also on storage. So I think in the first half of 2018, the price of lithium-ion batteries went down 35%, which is a huge drop. And I think that, you know, the combination of wind and solar with storage is something that makes renewable energy reliable as fossil fuel-based energy. There were a number of really fascinating articles about the polar vortex that occurred, and can renewable energy stand up in those kind of conditions? Is it reliable enough? Is there enough storage? And the resounding answer was yes to that question. So I think that is really exciting. But there's other sources as well, geothermal and hydro. So I think there's a lot of shift going on right now that we're seeing as coal becomes uneconomical. And I think all of that makes us optimistic about our ability to pivot and transition to a clean energy economy.
More questions?
Can you folks talk about carbon credits, how they work, and you talk about operating on 100% renewable? Are you getting carbon credits, or are you putting windmills up there?
Well, can I just jump in, and then Alan, you can jump in too. There's different ways to get to 100% renewable, that claim. And I'll just throw out some different examples. So there's a resort in Massachusetts, Jiminy Peak. They have a wind turbine, they have solar, they have a lot of on-site renewables that they're developing. And then other models like Squaw Valley is that they are working on off-site projects. There's power purchase agreements or PPAs where the electrons are not necessarily going to that resort, but you're creating a new energy source, a new renewable energy source. So there's different ways to get to 100% renewable, and I think it spans all the way from on-site development to power purchase agreements and then RECs, which I think is, like across the spectrum.
Yeah, and I think we're very pleased with a couple of facilities that we have here, and we're excited about doing another one. But that's not going to be the answer for us. We've brought renewable energy guys here to look at the place and can we do stuff on site. And it's just not a great place to do it. I think the solution is going to be bigger than just creating energy right here. And the best answer that I got from one of the people who actually sold wind and solar equipment was, if we're serious about this, we should buy a few thousand acres in eastern Colorado and start generating electricity out there. So I think it's really, we can do a little bit here, but the answer is really a bigger, much larger collective community business solution. I mean, the utilities are going to have to be out there creating energy in a different way.
So, but you could say you're 100% renewable, but still be operating on coal? Is that?
Yeah, so, and when you're talking about 100% renewable, you're talking about your electricity for the most part. I mean, that's what a lot of people are focused on. But there's also transport is a whole other part of your emissions impact, and heat as well. There's a lot of natural gas there. So, Alan, why don't you talk about
I might just touch on a little more. So energy comes from a grid with all kinds of energy being fed into it. Ultimately, the goal would be to have more and more of the energy going into the grid come from renewable sources. And when customer demand is wanting more and more renewables, and the appearance of coal is worse and worse and worse, and the public is telling Xcel, we don't want coal-fired plants, and their announcement last year to retire 2 of their coal plants earlier than they first planned, that's all great news. And when we're only going to be able to do so much physically right here, but if we can drive the whole grid to change and become more and more renewable, to me, that's the solution.
Yeah, I would just add one piece to that, because both really good points. But your question around 100% renewable versus carbon neutrality, right? So you can be carbon neutral and still be pulling and using energy from a carbon intensive grid, right, through offsets and RECs. But in terms of 100% renewable, your operating power is actually coming directly from renewable sources, kind of that twofold piece. And the extension on that, to Alan's point, is this leverage that the resorts that are these economic forces in their community is putting on the utilities to then shift at scale across the entire grid and start drawing a much larger percentage and trend to 100% of their energy coming from renewable sources is really, really important. When we look at the overall problem, we have 25 roughly corporations that are producing about 75% of these carbon emissions that we're dealing with. So no matter what, as perfect as resorts can be, which they should trend that way, you don't solve this problem. And so how do you use that leverage at the utility scale and the political vehicle to really drive this systemic change?
As individuals, what do you think we can do most to impact change? Is it changing our own lifestyles or advocacy or donating money?
Yeah, great question. It's twofold for us, right? So Geraldine had a good point around walking the walk and really saying, if you're going to go advocate on this issue, you need to address your own house as well. And I think that runs true for individuals. Is within this system, that is a carbon intensive system, what can you do? Can you fly less? Can you look at these big impacts that individuals have and address those? Can you do some carbon offsets for your own travel or your ski trips? Can you start to look at your own house and invest in solar? Can you donate? Of course, super important things. But for POW, above that, we want that, and we must have the civic engagement. We must vote, and again, make there be a political price for not being a climate champion in office. And so to really engage, talk to 5 people and get 5 friends to vote in the next election with climate in mind.
I'll comment too. So something that I've heard quite a bit recently from scientists' side is an important thing to do is just talk about it. Talk about it with people. It's not like a hard action, but it's raising awareness with people who don't necessarily think about this on a day-to-day basis. Like I work on this sort of stuff every day. I think about it a ton. But if you talk to people who don't think about it on an everyday basis, you're raising the subject, and maybe that'll lead to greater civic engagement.
What's your question?
We've had a lot of fire mitigation in this county in the last few years, and they cut and then burn. So that seems to be a little counterproductive to the carbon dioxide going into the air to burn all that. Is there another alternative to handling that brush and trees, bury, leaf, decay?
I'll try on that one. So you're asking what's the carbon footprint of prescribed burn of forests, basically? And I don't know of any good numbers on that. My guess is it's a really small number compared to the, carbon emissions of everyone in this room on our annual ski trips.
So if you drive to Montana, you'll see a lot of fires.
And also, the net effect of human forest management is for a decrease in fire. So fire is part of the natural system. So we are in effect sort of imposing at a small scale an implementation of what would be a natural process anyway, which would be that fire. Yeah.
Just a comment, Alan. Copper Mountain tried to do a wind turbine type thing at the top of the accelerator lift. And it worked for a while. And what happened was, with the high velocity of wind, they thought, great, we're going to get all this electricity. It was too much. The technology in the generators and in the systems could not control that stuff. So it's up here, it's a lot harder to do the wind generators and some of the things that you can do down in the flatlands. So you can't do this right on site. You have to do it off site.
Well said. Well said. Let's do a couple more questions.
Sorry.
Could you possibly compare what you're doing in your respective organizations or at the ski resort level with what might be happening maybe in other parts of the world, where in Japan, Europe, where the ski industry is just as important, how they're handling that situation?
Is there an international POW?
Yeah, it's a tough question to do, to group all the European countries and the countries that have ski economies. But we have 10 international chapters globally that we are looking to invest in even more in 2020 and beyond. We're just so domestically focused right now, but that are all wrestling with their own pieces of this, right? So how do we address carbon neutrality? How do we be leaders as ski industries and ski resorts around 100% renewable efforts? And then how do we drive policy? And the political environments are different, oftentimes better, but sometimes the same right now as the US. But yeah, they're equally concerned around the impacts of climate on ski and ski economies, and really, really feeling it and addressing it in their own local ways.
Just my own experience as I've met people from other countries in the business, and in general, I think in Europe people are much more ready much earlier they've accepted climate change. Ski areas that are around the glaciers, it's very clear there's all kinds of decommissioned lifts in Europe because glaciers have melted too much. So I don't know if I know too much about what they're doing, but I know they're talking about it much more openly, and they have been for much longer than we have.
So just to add in there are other countries that I think are more advanced than the United States when it comes to policy on climate change solutions, and talk about like putting a price on carbon, which is, you know, such a basic thing that has to happen in the future to solve climate change, and put an economic incentive into reducing carbon emissions. So Canada, the UK, they have a price on carbon. I mean, there's some states like California or group of 9 states in the East, the regional greenhouse gas initiative there. And I think next year China is going forward with a price on carbon. So there are other countries that are ahead of us on something like that. But when you look at, one example that I thought was fascinating was France putting a gas tax in place that was pretty high, and the result there was riots and uprisings, and it just wasn't working. And I think when I look at that, it's an example of how you can't just pick one solution and say, this is what we're gonna do. Because if all you do is raise the price of gas, and you don't give people an alternative, like cleaner cars, electric cars, or mass transit, you're not giving them a way to pivot and change behavior in the way they need to. So we need a more holistic, comprehensive approach, and I think France was a great example of that. But I do think there's a lot of experiments underway with putting a price on carbon, and but I do feel like, especially under the current administration, we've taken a couple steps backwards. I'm expecting us to put
and
lead.
fell down.
Yeah, maybe we'll put lead back in the paint. Try that for a while. See what happens with the kids eating the chips. But yeah, so.
I've read that the biggest challenge to shifting over to renewable energy is not generating it. We already have relatively affordable technologies to generate it, but storing it in the grid. But I don't understand that technology well enough to understand why it's so difficult to store energy at times when there's high wind or peak generation. Why is that the obstacle to making a shift over to renewable energy?
Well, I think the expense of storage has been an issue in the past. And again, what I'm reading is that those prices are coming down dramatically. I can't tell you why they're coming down, but I'm psyched that they're coming down. Because, you know, when the wind isn't blowing and when the sun is down at night, you know, those are the reasons why you need storage for renewable, to make it reliable. But can anyone answer why, for example, like the lithium-ion batteries are reducing in price? I'm gonna hand it over here.
Sure, I don't really know the answer to that, but I'm assuming it's just the technology is getting more advanced, we're getting better at manufacturing it.
Yeah, and higher demand, probably.
Yeah.
I think Christina had a thought over there.
The main problem with renewable energy is the infrastructure. It was built to produce power in one direction. If you're producing too much power from solar and wind, you need to send it back on the grid, and they don't know how to handle that. Right?
So something else that is really interesting that's coming up, I went to this talk by a climate economist historian about 3 years ago, and she said the thing that makes her most excited to read about is this idea called grid integration. And right now, all of the grids across the United States, they're like different regions, and they're not connected to each other. But there's this idea that once in the future, if we can get them all connected, then energy from different regions can flow more easily across it, and you can have a smarter grid that perhaps also embeds signals in it that, so let's say you have a smart refrigerator, and you see the power is more expensive right now because there's not enough wind or there's not enough sun. That signal can go to your refrigerator to say, don't have a cooling cycle right now because it's more expensive, wait a bit. And she was super excited about all of these possible future technologies that are going to help with those kind of issues of storage and grid.
In California, your thermostats are actually directly connected now, which is like really a crazy thought.
So we just came back we were at a conference in Jackson engaging with the top venture capitalists and leaders of companies in the renewable space. And these are folks who are just thinking about it from a business investment. So they understand climate, of course, but they're not really worried. They're not addressing it from an advocacy standpoint. And the people working on storage are projecting they're going to be at a place where it's scalable by 2030, that there's enough storage and technology, the price, all of those things are going to intersect, and we could be at a scalable zone by 2030. So that's one piece of the equation, right? How do we address the carbon side of that coin as well?
Well, I think we ought to take just a moment to thank Christina and Mike and Shaw for pulling this whole thing together. And of course, I'd really like to thank Elizabeth and Noah and Geraldine and Tori. Thank you guys so much. And lastly, thank you guys for coming today to participate. Obviously, you guys care about this, recognize how important it is. Help us out, keep spreading the word, act responsibly personally, vote. Thank you so much.